All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, students, whenever you're watching this. This is the first of what is going to be a series of videos over the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. It's one graph, just a long name. And today we're going to be focusing on the aggregate demand aspect of it. Now, this is going to be a multiple part series. For this week, though, all you really need to concern yourself with is just understanding the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve, how those two lines interact, what kind of information we can glean from them, and just how the shifts happen and what they really mean. Because here's the neat thing with this graph compared to the stuff we've done previously, because in this class we've already covered the production possibilities curve as well as just your regular, normal supply and demand graph, is that with this graph we will be taking a big picture look at an economy. Like, this is the graph of an economy. We could be like, this is America with this graph. Not just production possibilities curve where it's like, they can make two goods, and it's very simplified. This is a super real-world graph in terms of when we draw changes on this, I can direct you to those changes happening in the real world, much like our regular supply and demand graph did for individual businesses. This does that for the economy at large. In terms of important announcements and things to be aware of, if you're not one of my students watching this video, if you are a student from a different district, these are not short videos. These are my full in-class lectures. The short videos go for things like AC/DC economics. Those are quick. Those are 7 to 10 minutes for a lot of them. Mine are going to be the full lecture. So if you don't have a teacher for the class, I'd recommend watching these. If you are simply reviewing content you've learned before, I would watch things like AC/DC, maybe Khan Academy, stuff like that. This is literally like my class lectures, so they're beefy. The goal is to have 2 of these videos this week. If I get it all done in 45 minutes today, though, will only be the one video. So I'll try to cap it at 45 minutes of video here, because that's how long my typical class period runs. I think that should be just about it for announcements and anything else. Let's get into it. So, with everything. Aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Now, need to give you a bit of a warning for everybody in here. This graph, this model, frankly, Unit 3, this unit, is the most asked about thing on the AP macro exam. It's about a quarter of the exam is Unit 3 out of 6 units. That math lines up to be like, oh, that's a lot. Yeah, it's about a quarter. I can almost guarantee you that you will have to draw this graph at least once in the FRQ section, because that's been a very constant trend. Last year was the only year they didn't have that happen, and that's because last year they couldn't do graphs on the macro exam due to the test being remote. So this is almost a guarantee that you will have to do this graph. So you need to understand this model. It is a crazy important concept because it has an incredible real-world application aspect where we can take things like COVID, graph it on this graph, and I can show you what's happening in the economy based on it. It is a simplification of what's happening in the economy, but not a simplification in the way that production possibilities curves were, which is an unrealistic simplification. These are very realistic simplifications that we're doing that remove some variables from it, but for the most part give you an idea of what should happen, holding everything else constant. This is a very important one to take detailed notes in. If you have questions for me, feel free to comment in the video with questions. If you're one of my students, feel free to use the forums on Moodle. Trust me, you need to ask questions on this stuff. If you're not getting it, you need to ask. Listen very carefully as I explain things. If you're writing and listening at the same time, it's not a bad idea to pause the video, jot down the stuff on the slides, and then turn it on and listen to me talk through it, because there are things there that I'll be saying that are not typed on the slide that are important. So do not sleep on these notes. These are crazy important. Okay, so some background knowledge before we get into the graph. We've covered this a little bit in my class, but a thing to know about the economy is that its activity is going to fluctuate from year to year. It's going to have its ups and downs. It's the business cycle. On average, production goes up. 2020 is an exception, but that's largely due to COVID limiting our ability to actually even just have businesses open. On average, over the last 50 years, we have our real GDP grow by about 3% per year. That's massive over a long stretch of time to have actual productivity raising by about 3% per year. That's over 10 years, that's 30%. Over 20 years, that's 60%. That's a massive increase in productivity. But in some years, that growth isn't occurring, which is a recession. Remember that a recession is a period of time of declining economic activity, normally marked by declining real GDP. That is your most obvious way to check if there is a recession happening. So right now, in America, and really in basically every country in the world, we are experiencing a recession due to the COVID pandemic. Now, with these fluctuations, there are three big things you need to know about them. One, when we say that variables change, things like income, prices, wages, unemployment, these are linked. Almost every macroeconomic variable is linked to another. A very obvious one based on GDP that we've talked about is that spending and income are linked. Every dollar spent is a dollar earned. When GDP goes up, it means that the overall spending level in your economy has gone up. But if you're spending more money, that means people are also making more money. Doesn't necessarily mean every individual person is, but as a sum total, people are making more money. It could be business owners making more money. That could be investment firms making more money. But it's still more money being made as well as more money being spent. So income and spending are positively linked variables. The most important one of those, which is actually your second key fact, is that as production falls, as output falls, unemployment rises. This is an incredibly important one for this graph because this graph, like the business cycle, will have output as one of its axes. And when you have that, that means that when output goes up, when your axis point, like your x value, is higher, means that unemployment is also lower. It's an additional variable that you can glean from the graph. If we are producing more stuff, that means we have, presumably, more people working, or businesses will have more money so they can hire more people. Either way, if we have more spending, unemployment would go down. And if output goes down, if we're producing less stuff, businesses are making less money, they'll have to lay off some workers. We'll see more unemployment. And the third key fact is that for the most part, the overall fluctuation, like is our economy going to be doing well or poorly, are generally irregular and unpredictable. They're not consistent. It's a really tricky thing with economics of like, oh, this is always going to work, because otherwise we would know what to do every single time in every single situation as a country, and that hasn't proved to be true over the course of human history. So economics is a little bit irregular. There are so many variables in the real world that we can't say for certain, pushing this button will result in growth, because sometimes we push that button and it doesn't, because there's something else going on that is inhibiting that is limiting that behavior. So they're a little bit irregular and unpredictable. Like things like a recession, we know they happen, and they happen with some frequency in American history, but they happen for different reasons every time. Like we have COVID, okay, like unpredictable in the sense of like, couldn't have told you last year that we would have had this massive economic crisis due to COVID. Couldn't have told you 2 years ago that we would have had it. The housing market crash. Well, there were signs that was happening in the economy. It's not like you can predict, there will be a housing market crash every 8 years. Those aren't consistent things. These are specific events that cause a economic crisis. And these fluctuations are often referred to as the business cycle. That's a graph that we've covered in the course. If you haven't watched a business cycle video yet, make sure that you watch it. It's just the wavelength of our economy over time. And here is kind of a real-world example of the business cycle. This is a time period ago. This is a while ago. This is from 65 to 2000, basically. This is our real GDP over that time period. We have periods of time where that GDP is stagnating or dropping. Those are our recessions. They are happening with some frequency. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's another one in 1996. Teeny tiny one, like a little blip down the radar. Kind of like that 1991, which was just like a tiny little dip. The 2000 recession, or 2001 recession, and the 2008 recession, and now the 2021, which is a lot scarier if we're looking at the graph. But we see these little inconsistent, not the same time period each time, not the same gap each time, recessions. They happen, but how they happen changes. So that first thing we mentioned, these variables fluctuate together. Mentioned that if production rises, income should also rise. They fluctuate by different amounts a lot of the time. It's not always a 1-to-1 ratio exactly. But they are linked. A lot of variables will be linked together, especially income and production, unemployment and output, price level and inflation rate. A lot of variables are linked in economics. This is investment spending over that exact same time period. And as you can see, the recessions are very apparent on this graph as well. The exact same time periods, the exact same time windows. You can see a link where, so investment spending and real GDP are positively linked. Yeah, investment spending is one of the components of GDP, so that's a variable that will have a very obvious linkage. As output falls, unemployment rises, and vice versa. So this is changes in real GDP are inversely related to changes in the unemployment rate. I am emphasizing this. This is crazy important. This will be the basis of a future graph we talk about, which is the Phillips curve. And it also tells you why recessions are super dangerous, because if a recession is a time period of slowing economic activity where there is less spending and therefore less GDP, it will also mean there will be a considerable rise in unemployment. Because if GDP going down causes unemployment to go up, then a recession, a period of time where there is consistently lower GDP, will have lots of unemployment. Very damaging for your economy, because those people who don't have jobs can't spend, which then creates this snowball rolling downhill effect of, okay, we're spending less, more people are losing jobs, those people can't spend, so there's less spending, so there's more people losing their jobs. And here's the scary thing: if you have a job in a recession, a very common thing for people to do, like right now, is me, I have a job right now. A lot of people save their money in recessions because they're scared. They're worried about losing a job. They don't make that big purchase. They're like, you know what, I was thinking about buying a home, but my job, I could lose it due to this COVID pandemic thing. I might want to be very careful and not spend that money. Cool. If we're not spending, though, it's going to make this problem worse. One of the things that makes recessions dangerous is the very common human behavior in recessions leads to more severe recessions. So that's super scary. Here's unemployment rate in that exact same time period, and bingo, looking at that same graph, we see a lot of these spikes are happening in the recessions. In fact, all of the spikes are happening in the recessions. Teeny tiny little bumps, sure, but your big gradual jumps in it are huge. The last one is, and it's important to mention this from the standpoint of like, what can we do? It's really impossible to predict accurately economic fluctuations. These recessions can be close together, they can be far apart. Longest period of consistent growth was up to COVID, between the recession of 2008 to 2009, so we kind of got out of it, to COVID was the longest consistent period of economic growth in our country. It's about 11 years, a little over 10, about 10 and a half, 11 years in terms of consistent economic growth. That is very hard for us to do. It required a lot of effort by really 2 presidential administrations to maintain that growth. And frankly, very fortunate economic circumstances. Nothing crazy happened in that 10-year period for us economically. We were able to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that had happened in previous decades until COVID. So those things are very important to be aware of and to mention. Okay, so that's all just background stuff. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we've talked about the supply and the demand graph before, at least the short version of it, the small version of it, the, hey, supply and demand of beans, and like, what's the demand for beans, how badly people want to buy beans, and supply of beans was how badly businesses wanted to make and sell beans, and it's like that whole bit. What we're going to do here is we're going to take that model and zoom out. And we're going to zoom out a frigging ton, because aggregate means total. So when we say the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, what we're talking about is the supply and demand of all goods and services within our economy. At least all the ones that count towards GDP. So we're talking about total demand, the overall demand for everything in our economy, and the overall supply for everything. And everything is air quotes around everything, but everything in our economy. And we can use this graph to sort of track our economic activity, which can also let us track economic inactivity, things like recessions, around what we refer to as our long-run trend. That long-run bit's going to come up a lot, especially in next week's videos. But the basic idea is we saw these sort of growth chart for our economy, and if you see in the business cycle, you see that sort of trend line at what was called potential output, our ideal amount of production. That's our long-run trend, is that our economy is supposed to sort of gravitate around this trend line. We should be trying to get there or maintain being around that level at all times. It's like a reasonable economic goal is a good way to think about your long-run trend. It's like that's where we should be if everything is operating smoothly. We're not going too fast or too slow. If we're like, Goldilocks and the Three Bears style. Too fast causes inflation, too slow, and you have a recession just right, and you're on your long-run trend. Everything is smooth sailing. Your economy is doing about as well as it can reasonably be doing. So this graph will end up being the macro, and this is AP macroeconomics, version of supply and demand. So let's talk about these 2 lines. Visually speaking, this graph will look identical to your normal supply and demand graphs, at least in the short run. There will be a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. You can still, in my class, do this little like X graph thing for shifts and stuff. But here's your basic idea of these two lines. Aggregate demand is the total quantity of all goods and services that everyone wants to buy. This is not limited to consumers. This is households want to buy these things, firms want to buy these things, the government wants to buy these things, foreign people want to buy these things, all of that stuff. Everything that just about anybody wants to buy, as long as it would be counted in GDP. So things like used goods, intermediate goods, stocks, and bonds, those are not included here, but just about everything is. The aggregate supply curve shows the total quantity of all goods and services that firms produce and sell at each price level. Now, the thing to mention there is that price level is the price of all goods and services. So here is our full aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. Looks very similar. Aggregate demand instead of demand, aggregate supply instead of supply. Your x-axis here, normally on a supply and demand graph, your x-axis would be quantity of the good, but there isn't one particular good. This is just everything being produced in our economy. So we would say quantity of output, or, and this is what I typically will use here because it helps with other questions in the class a lot, real GDP, as that is our best measure of total output in our economy. Either one of those would be fine for your x-axis. It's also important to mention that with the formula for GDP being add up all the spending or add up all the income, they could, frankly, technically throw like aggregate income as your x-axis just to freak you out a bit. That's in play because everything that's produced has an income value attached to it, and then you could delineate that down to what you're making. It's annoying. Don't like they do that sometimes. Your y-axis is price level. Now, on a supply and demand graph, a regular one, it was just price of the good, but this needs to be price of all goods. And hey, we actually have a word for that. We talked about that when we talked about inflation. Price level is the overall level of aggregate prices in your economy. It's like, hey, how much, if price level is going up, that means inflation's happening. If price level is going down, that means we have either disinflation or deflation. And prices are slowing down or getting lower. So price level is just total prices in your economy. Price of everything is a okay way to think about it. You have an equilibrium, price level, equilibrium output. You can see equilibrium output written as, this is annoying, capital Y, capital Y-E, because capital Y is the abbreviation for total income or equilibrium income in your economy. Weird. Price level would be like PLE or PE. That's a normal way to abbreviate that. But that is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. At least, again, I'm going to say this 4 times, you're not going to know what I mean until later, but this is the graph in the short run. So let's focus on aggregate demand. That's the game plan. That's the main goal for this video, is to explain all of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is all of our spending in our economy is the best way to track it. We're talking about demand for all goods and services. How the heck do we track demand for everything? We track what people buy. We track spending. And how do we track spending, y'all? GDP. The formula for GDP is C plus I plus G plus XN. That's called the expenditures approach. It is the most commonly used approach, and when people ask about the components of GDP, they are often referring to these 4 things. C, consumer spending. I, investment spending. That is, again, spending by businesses on capital, mostly. G, government spending. And XN, which is net exports. These are your 4 components of aggregate demand. As you have a lower price level, you have a increased quantity demanded. Remember this thing from our supply and demand notes that when you change the price level, you do not change the demand curve, you're simply moving along the curve. So if there's a lower price level, there would be a higher quantity demanded. But why? Why does that work that way? There are 3 big reasons as to why price level and quantity of output are inversely related when it comes to demand. The first one is called the wealth effect, which has to do with consumption spending. The second one has to do with investment spending, and it's called the interest rate effect. And the third one has to do with net exports, and it's called the exchange rate effect. So I'm going to go through each of these. Understanding them is like on a low level of importance scale, but being able to take any of those and realize, oh, okay, that's why it's downward sloping, works. Oh, well, that's weird. Okay, I need to change the highlighter font for that. But The first one, the wealth effect. Lower price level means that prices are going down. Cool. If you're making the same amount of money as before and prices are getting lower, you can do what? Buy more stuff. Cool. So a decrease in price level makes consumers feel more wealthy. You are getting paid the same amount, but that amount means more. You can buy more with it. The value of your real wages goes up when price level goes down. So you'd be willing to spend more money, which would mean that that increase in consumer spending means there's a larger quantity of goods and services demanded. You are willing to buy a little bit more. So a little bit higher quantity of stuff is getting bought because you feel, and technically are in the scale of like value, wealthier. It's the wealth effect. The interest rate effect. This one's a little more complicated, so we have to explain this a little bit. For those of you that are in the like sort of gray area on interest rates are the price of borrowing. So when you like borrow money from somebody, you have an interest rate associated with that you've got to pay back. There's also the return on like investments, so like savings. When you put your money in a savings account or buy a bond, the interest rate will make you money. But let's go with that borrowing aspect first. If you have a lower price level, that will reduce the interest rate. I will explain that in a future unit. That's actually a whole other graph thing that we have to go through. But short version, lower price level will reduce interest rates, which makes borrowing more affordable. One that will increase consumer spending, yes, but also businesses will capitalize on that. If you're a business and you have to make large-scale purchases on things like factories and machinery and capital, being able to borrow money helps a frigging ton. So whenever you have lower interest rate, businesses capitalize on that and take out large loans or buy new factory machinery with that loan money. So the lower the interest rate, the more investment spending will happen. It's the same idea. Lower interest rate, lower price level, lower interest rate, higher quantity demanded. So inverse relationship between price level and spending. The last one is the exchange rate effect. This one will also be tied to a future unit and graph, but I can still explain it here. If there is a fall in U.S. price level, it means the prices of goods and services in the United States is lower. That is super awesome if you are not from America too, because guess what they can do? Buy more of our stuff. If prices are lower in America, that makes American goods cheaper for everybody, not just for Americans. So if you're from Mexico and you're buying an American good, then that good is now cheaper because the price level is lower, the prices are lower. So they can buy more, which is going to cause net exports to go up because that'll be more exports for America. So lower price level, higher exports, lower price level, higher consumer spending, lower price level, higher investment spending. That's why these things are linked together. It's why there's an inverse relationship between those two variables. So let's get the important thing down. What moves your line? What causes the line to move? You move along the line if there's a change in price level. What causes the aggregate demand curve to shift? 4 things. This is amazing. It's super chill. It's the CIGXN stuff. Those are our 4 things that make up aggregate demand. Cool. If we change those, you change aggregate demand. Basically, anything that affects GDP will affect aggregate demand. There are a bunch of things that could fall under this umbrella. It's in the notes tab of the PowerPoint, but I'll list some off. For consumption spending, if there is a change to wealth or income, say that there is a reduction in income taxes. Say the government lowers taxes on people. Cool, specifically income taxes. Well, if there's lower income taxes, I'll have more money, and if I have more money, what am I going to do with that money? Spend it, right? I'm just going to spend it. So that would cause more overall spending, so aggregate demand would increase. A good way to think about this is that aggregate demand, since it's made up of C, I, G, and XN, really is represented by our overall spending in our economy. If there's more spending, that means there has been more demand for things. If there's less spending, it means there's been less demand for things. So for consumers, for C, wealth, income, interest rates, I mentioned affect that one too. A lower interest rate means you might be more willing to borrow money to buy like a car or go to college. Those are things that count towards GDP. Those would count as consumer spending. And a weird one is expectations of economic conditions. Basically, if we think the economy is going to be doing really poorly in the future, we save our money. Because we are getting nervous about that economy and how it might affect us negatively. So you get nervous about the economy doing poorly, you save money. If you're feeling confident with the economy and how well it's performing, then you might be willing to spend more. So think of it as like a comfort level. If you're really comfortable, you're more willing to spend. If you're really nervous, you're less willing to spend because you're freaked out. For investment spending, we mentioned things like interest rates will affect investment spending. Same with that expectations of economic conditions bit. If we think the economy is doing well, we'll spend more, and we being businesses in investment spending. The weird one for investment is an unplanned increase in inventory. Inventory meaning their back stock. If they see an increase in inventory, an unplanned one, means they've got a whole bunch of extra stuff in stock. Do they need to spend that much money? No, not particularly. They can scale back. They've got a bunch of goods that they need to sell right now. They should scale back their spending. So if there's a bunch of inventory, then they can decrease their spending right now. If they've got a lot less in inventory than they thought, a lot less of back stock, they're going to need to ramp up their spending to meet whatever consumer demand for their good is happening. For government spending, that'll be due to fiscal and monetary policy. We'll get into fiscal policy later in this unit. We'll get into monetary policy next unit. Just know that fiscal policy are things like changing taxes and changing government spending. So things like the government increasing the budget for education is an increase in government spending. It is a fiscal policy. Monetary policies have to do with the Federal Reserve. If you don't know what that is, then you'll have no idea what any of those are. We will get into those next unit. Ex and net exports, a few things could happen here. Relative income, say if incomes rise in Canada, Canadians will be buying more stuff from everybody, including Americans, which will lead to more exports for America. So we're kind of rooting for our trade partners there. You want your trade partners to be doing well economically, they can buy more of your stuff then. We mentioned price level. So like if price level is lower in Canada than in America, Americans will probably buy more Canadian goods because those goods are cheaper. And Canadians will buy fewer American goods because they might as well just buy it from their own country. Those things affect aggregate demand. Exchange rates. I have an example that I'll show you with that one that's a little more interesting. So basically, if it affects GDP, it affects AD. These are just the four big things you're looking at. So when you're thinking, like, what's the scenario? Like, does this affect CIG or XN? Okay, it does. All right, it's going to affect AD then. Just like with our normal demand stuff, shifted to the right is an increase, shifted to the left is a decrease. That is never going to change here. That is always the case. That is always what we do with it. And so here are some practice problems. Take a pause on the video. Make sure you know what you're doing. Draw the shift for each of these and just be like, okay, so this should increase AD, this should decrease AD. And think about it logically what's going on. 4 is tricky, so 4 is the one where I'll have to go through a full explanation here. But you tell me what's going to happen in each of these situations. Okay? Go. I need to pull up the pen real quick. And yeah, pause the video so you can work through it. There's the pen. Okay. So first one, income increases nationally. I've got more money. What am I gonna do with it? Spend it. Cool. AD goes up. So that should be an increase in AD. 2, a reduction of taxes on car manufacturers. You are a business owner. You make cars. You're being taxed less. What can you do? Spend more. For an AD problem, you're always thinking, can they spend more or less? Oh, sorry, that should be an increase in AD, not a decrease. Whoops, daisy. Okay, Congress signs a bill decreasing the military budget. That is government spending. And decreasing the military budget means there is less government spending going on. It should be mentioned, if some of you guys who are big on like government stuff and are aware of how taxes work and what taxes are used for, some people tend to like link these two things together a little bit too hard. Where it's like, okay, if there's an increase in taxes, then the government has more money to spend and can spend more. Need to spoil something for you here. That's not how that works in the course, mostly because the class is always like, what happens first? And the first thing when you raise taxes is that people have less money to spend. But the second thing is, in the real world, that actually isn't the case. America is a great example of, we lower taxes and increase government spending all the frickin' time. It's been, frankly, the modus operandi of the Republican Party the last 2 times they've had a president, with President Trump and with President George W. Bush. Both of them cut taxes and actually had higher spending than they did at the previous year. Because they can't cut things, They just lower taxes, so they have to borrow a lot more money. It's why the government's in a lot of debt. Is there's a lot of times where we cut taxes but don't cut spending. We don't do both. So you can't assume when there's a change in taxes or a change in government spending that there is a countering change for taxes and spending to offset that. We don't roll that rule. 4, this is the complicated one. So this is for a unit we haven't covered yet. This is technically Unit 6, which is international trade, namely with currency exchange. So the US dollar appreciates in value. It means that the US dollar is worth more when it comes to other currencies. Appreciating in value means it can buy more of other currencies. Okay, what happens to net exports? Well, if our currency is worth more, we can buy more foreign goods. That's how appreciation works. But here's the tricky part. Us buying foreign goods, is that good or bad for our spending? It means we're spending more, yes, but we're spending more on imports. And if you remember the formula for GDP, it's C plus I plus G plus XN. And XN is net exports. That's exports minus imports. Imports are a negative component. So the US dollar appreciating in value is actually bad. It's bad for our GDP. For consumers, it might feel very good because now you can buy a bunch of foreign goods for cheap. But America as an economy doesn't really want you to be buying foreign goods all the time. It generally doesn't help our economy for you to do that. It is money that could be spent on stuff made here. So when you do that, when our currency is worth more internationally, which is what the appreciation thing here means, it actually hurts us from a aggregate demand standpoint because we're buying things that do not help our economy. So there's just a little bit of practice on aggregate demand. Let me check the next slide real quick. Cool. So let me go back to the bigger camp thing. So in terms of big lessons off of this video, the big stuff is know what this graph represents. It's the graph of an economy. The second thing, know what the graph's axes are. Make sure that you drew that, the price level, real GDP one. Know that output and unemployment are inversely related. That's going to come up a lot in the next video. And know what things change AD and how do they change. Okay, be very careful about that. It's very important to know how AD changes and how it's going to be affected. In the next video, which I'll end this video here in a second, in the next video I'll be going over short-run aggregate supply as well as changes to this graph when it comes to equilibrium moving and what happens when you change equilibrium points. So the next video is going to be more on aggregate supply, specifically short-run, talking about how that line works, what short-run versus long-run is, and what changing things when both lines exist does to your economy, which is the big impact of the graph. So, video is going to end here. This one timed pretty dang well, so I'm glad that we were able to get through it in a decent amount of time. But that is it for today's video. Please watch the next one as soon as you can. Appreciate it, guys. Have a good one.